Hello and welcome to Badger Castle Creations. Today I'm going to be showing you how I turned this toy tuk-tuk into a post-apocalyptic camper van, so stay tuned. I started by removing any decals or stickers that the toy had, followed by giving it a good sanding in order to help paint stick to it. Next up, I decided to remove some pieces. Starting with the wheels, I cut them away with some wire cutters and then used a screwdriver to pry out the bottom panel, also getting rid of the big headlight at the front while I was at it. After that was done, I began adding things onto the van, starting with some corrugated foam to represent corrugated metal. I used a piece to cover one of the entranceways, and then used some knitting mesh to cover the rest of the gap. I then used some more knitting mesh to cover the windows, covering the back window from the inside and covering the front window with a very large panel on the outside. After that was complete, I moved on to the painting stage. Starting with basing the whole thing in brown, I then mixed together a slightly more orange brown and stippled that over to give it some variation. I should also mention that I intentionally gave it a very thick undercoat, especially on the roof area, in order to give it some degree of texture that would show through in the later stages. Once that was dry, it was on to adding some colour. I decided to go with a white and blue colour scheme for the van, so mixing together a light blue, I wiped most of the paint off with some kitchen roll and very lightly dabbed it onto the lower areas, still making sure to have the brown showing through. I repeated the same process with a white paint for the upper half, once again removing most of the paint from my brush and using a rough stippling motion to get an uneven coating. And once again, I used the same process with a dark green for the corrugated metal. Once the colours were done, I then came in with a dry brushing of silver all over the piece, especially focusing on any risen areas or corners that would have had paint naturally chip away. I then did the same with a rust colour, but removed even more paint from my brush as to have a more subtle effect. I then went over the whole roof with a homemade brown wash that was simply a watered down brown paint, and then dabbed any excess with a rag. Once that was dry, I decided to highlight some of the risen areas on the roof. Starting with a gunmetal colour, I then added in patches of the rust colour, followed by an orange wash to add rust streaks, and then finally back over with the gunmetal to highlight the risen bits once more. After all that, I still felt as though it looked too clean, so I decided to come in with a black wash all over. For this, I used a Nuln oil, but you could just as easily mix together a black wash by watering down black paint or black ink. I went all over the piece as stated, and once again, like the previous wash, removed any excess with a rag. Even after that, I still felt as though the white areas were too white, so I decided to come in with a sponging of brown over any overly white areas, as well as the bottom of the piece where I felt that mud would have naturally accumulated over time. Finally, I went back over the whole piece with one last dry brushing of silver to bring back some of the highlights. So there you have it, one post-apocalyptic camper van. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.